Good morning. Thank you for turning up on an early Sunday morning. I interpret this as meaning that you actually like this stuff.
Yeah.
That you're willing to get up early. The 6 people who are willing to get up early on a Sunday morning. We're the Salem Trayned band. We reenact a militia company from Salem, Massachusetts in the first decade of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Massachusetts Bay Colony was the second English colony in New England. Plymouth was established in 1620. Massachusetts Bay Colony was chartered in 1629. And Salem was the original capital. Salem was the first capital of Massachusetts. Then they moved to Charlestown, and then they moved to Boston. So Salem is technically the first town in Massachusetts. And the colonists, when they came over, they brought the English militia system with them. This was actually a common feature in Europe at that time. Towns had militias, and in England there was a strong tradition of militia companies acting as a sort of self-defense force in the town. And so the English colonists, when they came to Salem, the first thing they did was establish a militia company. And a matter of fact, they bought equipment for the militia company in England before they even came over. In 1629, they started buying up stuff for a 100-man infantry company. Shipped it over at the very beginning of the colony. And we reenact this militia company as it appeared in the 1630s, the first decade. 1629 is when Massachusetts Bay Colony is chartered. 1637 is when there's the first regimental muster. As the colony grew, every town had an infantry company. Eventually there were enough towns at the end of what's that, 8 years. There were enough towns after 8 years that they could put the companies together into regimental formations, and they established 3 regiments of foot in the spring of 1637. And what we're going to do is we're going to show you a little bit of the infantry drill that they would have used when they trained. All able-bodied men between the ages of 16 and 60 were required to own weapons and belong to the militia. And you had to drill every week. Saturday was drill day. And if you go to Salem, if people are familiar with Salem, there's Salem Common in the middle of Salem, is still there. Salem Common was bought in 1636 by the Massachusetts General Court, and it was not a common like most towns have. A common is actually a common grazing area. The idea is that the people who lived in the town could all bring their animals down to the common and graze them there, and then they take them home at night. Salem Common was bought as a drill field, what they called an artillery garden back then. So it was the first drill field in the English colonies in North America. And the first regimental muster was on Salem Common in the spring of 1637. And they drilled they called it the East Regiment. There was the East Regiment, the North Regiment, and the South Regiment. They correspond to Essex County, Middlesex County, and Suffolk County today. We represent mostly the pikemen of an infantry company. The Salem Trayned band, as they called it, the Salem Militia Company, was organized as a typical European company of foot. And about 2/3 of the men in that company would have been armed with muskets. We brought one musketeer just to show you what a musketeer would dress like in that particular period. But in the real company, 2/3 of the men would have been armed with firearms. One of the interesting things about Salem is that the establishment of this colony was fairly well funded. It was an attraction to Puritans at that time to get out of England. There were religious strifes going on in England. There were a group of religious dissenters called Puritans, and they decided that the easiest way to deal with their disagreements with the Crown and other Englishmen was to leave. And so there was a big attraction for Puritans to come over to Massachusetts. And so it had actually attracted fairly well-to-do people, middle-class people. On the original charter for Massachusetts Bay Colony, there's 4 knights listed by name on it. And so they were fairly well-financed, and what that meant was when they established their militia company, they brought the latest equipment, the latest European equipment. And so, for example, this is actually a flintlock. Early flintlocks had been introduced at the beginning of the 17th century, and they brought 100 guns with them, and over 60 of them were flintlocks. So this is an early style flintlock. They brought these long spears with them too. 1/3 of the men would have been armed with pikes, which is just a really long spear. These are 16 feet long, plus the head. So the heads aren't all the same size on these pikes. So they're 16 and a half to 16 foot 9 inches long, very, very long. And their purpose is to serve as a mobile fortification for the musketeers. You put the pikemen in the middle of your formation. You put the musketeers normally on the flanks of the formation. And on the battlefields of Europe in the early 17th century, you still have armored cavalry. You have heavily armored men riding around on horses, some with lances, some with pistols, some with carbines. And the firearms in this period are complicated to load and fire. There are 42 steps in the loading and firing drills that they used for training with the muskets. It takes a trained man about 20 seconds to load and fire one of these guns. And with the range of these types of muskets, cavalry can get from out of range to on top of you in 20 seconds. So the primary purpose of the pikemen in the middle of formation was to protect the infantry company from a cavalry charge. That's what the pikes are for. Now, we have a couple other impressions that we do. Down at the end, we have our ensign. You'll notice that we're all wearing different colored clothing. There were no uniforms in the militia in Massachusetts Bay. Our armies were not generally uniformed in this particular period. Great nobles like the Pope or the kings and things like that would have what they called liveried troops who would wear uniforms. Most soldiers just wore their regular clothes, and especially the militia in Massachusetts. So we're just wearing our street clothes that we would have worn to the drill. The problem is if you're not wearing uniforms, how do people tell who you are? And this is why the ensigns become very important. This is our company standard. Every company had an ensign, and it was different. And it has the Cross of St. George to indicate that we're English, and then a color that indicates which particular company in the regiment we represent. And the person who carries it's actually an officer. The infantry company has 3 officers. You have a captain, I represent the captain, then there's a lieutenant, and then there's the ensign. So ensigns are very important when you don't have uniforms and you've got crowded battlefields. So we've got an officer like me, we've got a musketeer, we've got 5 pikemen, and we've got an ensign. And we're going to show you a little bit of the drill that they would have used with these pikes. The pikes are not heavy. They weigh about 8 or 9 pounds. The problem with them is they're extremely cumbersome because of their length. And you have to fight in close formations with them. We'll show you why this is important in a little while. In order to be able to maneuver something 16 feet long in close formation takes a lot of practice. It was actually more prestigious at the time to be a pikeman than it was to be a musketeer. They considered that any idiot could learn to shoot somebody with a gun, but you had to have special strength, stamina, and intelligence in order to be a pikeman. This position is called the order. This is the resting position with the pike on the ground. Now, one of the things you'll notice too is that armies, soldiers drilling in this particular period didn't look like modern soldiers or 19th century soldiers. They're not the stiff, braced Prussian looks that we're used to with precision drill. They've got the 17th century attitude. You know, you're in a pose, with your hand on your sword, in a little more relaxed position. But this is a good resting position. Keeps the pikes up out of the way and doesn't take any energy. If you're going to march in the presence of the enemy, you advance your pike. We have to be a little careful because we barely clear the ceiling in here. This is called position of advance. This is the way you march in the presence of the enemy. The pike is actually balanced on 2 fingers. You've got a 16-foot pole balanced on 2 fingers, locked in place by having your forearm wrap around it. It takes a fair amount of practice to be able to march like this. But it keeps the pikes up out of the way. They don't bang into each other. They don't snag on stuff. They didn't have to worry about telephone wires and things like that, like we do. But the other thing about it is you can go straight into the attack. Charge your pike. This is the way you hold the pike when you fight with it. You brace your left hand against your chest. You extend your right hand as far as you can behind you, like this. What that means is that when something hits the pike, it's your skeleton that takes the shock. You know, your arm is fully extended. It's not your muscles that's being used to control the pike, it's your skeleton. So you're really well braced. You can push really hard in this position. Pike's leveled at your enemy. Order your pike. However, it takes a lot of practice and a lot of concentration to carry pikes around like this. It also takes a lot of effort to keep them level like that. If you're not in the presence of the enemy, if you're not afraid of being attacked, you carry them in a much more comfortable position. Shoulder your pike level. You balance it on your shoulder. It's not very hard to carry 8 pounds around on your shoulder with one hand. You can march forever doing this. The problem with this is you've now got an 8-foot pole in front of you and an 8-foot pole behind you. So you have to open up your formation before you can march like this. But you do train to be prepared for any eventuality. So you learn things like charge your pike to the rear. Face about and shoulder your pike. Port your pike. This is called position of port because the entrances to fortifications back then were called sally ports. And this is the way you march through the sally port to make sure you don't hit the overhead with the pointy end of the pike. Order your pike. Another way to deal with the cumbersome length is to put it behind you. Cheek your pike. Well, it's supposed to be a way to deal with the cumbersome length. This position, you can fight with just the pointy bit and leave the pole behind you out of the way. It's called cheeking because the pikes have metal straps along the top of them to hold the head on and keep people from being able to cut it off with a sword. And those straps are called cheeks or languettes. And you're holding it by the cheeks. That's why it's called cheek your pike. Trail your pike. You can also march like this. You can march through broken brush and country, dragging the pike behind you. It keeps it from tangling and stuff. But once again, you do have to be prepared for other eventualities. So you learn cheek your pike. Charge your pike. Practice going right back into the attack. Order your pike. Advance your pike. Now I mentioned that there's cavalry on the battlefields of Europe. If you're fighting against cavalry, you can use the psychology of the horse against the cavalryman. If you want to drive your car into a brick wall, if you point your car at the brick wall and you step on the gas, the car will hit the brick wall. If you want to ride your horse into a brick wall, the horse gets a vote about that. Horses will naturally go around objects. If you ride a horse through the woods, you don't have to tell the horse to go around the trees. It'll do that automatically. Now, it won't worry about low branches. That could be a problem for you. But it won't hit the tree trunks. It'll go around the tree trunks. So what you do is you use that psychology against the cavalrymen. You mass your formation so that everybody's shoulder to shoulder, and to a horse it looks like a solid object. It looks like a wall. So when the cavalryman charges it, the horses will actually try to go around it instead of going over it or through it. Files by your right hand, take your close order. So you pack your pikemen together shoulder to shoulder, and they look like a solid object to the horse. Order your pike. And then you can do things like you can put your musketeers behind your pikemen, if you would be so good. And when the cavalry charges up at you, you foot your pike and draw your sword. Now what they've done is they've braced the pike against their right foot on the ground, and they're holding it with their left hand. And that means that if 1,100 pounds of dog food hits the end of the pike, the impact goes into the ground, not into the pikeman. And it also gives you a free hand, so you have a sword drawn too. So if a horse does manage to work its way into the formation, you've got a secondary weapon. And then you can have your musketeers behind them, make ready, present, give fire. So the horse charge will stall at the pike points, and your musketeers can volley into the pikemen. Now you notice something about these pike points. They're above my head. They're no threat to me. they're eye level for the horse. You got the horse's attention, you got the cavalryman's attention. Put up your sword and order your pike. Now normally in combat 2, you would protect your ensign by retiring him into the formation. Now, one of the things that you may be wondering is, why are the pikes 16 feet long? What's the point of having something that big? This is an officer's weapon. This is called a partisan. You know, I mentioned that we don't wear uniforms. The way you can tell I'm the captain is I have a red sash on and I'm carrying a partisan. The officers in the company carry partisans. The sergeants carry halberds. You can tell the sergeants because they've got a pole weapon that's got an axe blade on it and a hook on the back and a point on the end. That's how you can tell the sergeants. You can tell the captain by his red sash and his partisan. The lieutenant wears a yellow sash and has a partisan. The partisan is specifically designed for breaking into pike formations. That's what these little hooky things are for, is for snagging the pike poles. You can also defend with the other end of it. This is 8.5 feet long. It's a very handy size. You know, I can keep an enemy at a distance, I can close up easily, I can fight with both ends. You know, it doesn't snag on things. If 8.5 feet is a good length for my partisan, why aren't my pikes 8.5 feet long? Well, the reason is you actually fight your pikemen in multiple ranks. We're only showing you one rank. A normal pike formation would have 80 men in it. A typical European pike formation would have 80 men in it. It would be 8 men wide and 10 ranks deep. So what we're going to do is we're going to simulate that for you so you get an idea. Advance your pike to your left hand wheel. Halt. Files by your left hand, take your order. Face by your right hand. Okay, so we've opened ourselves up to our normal order, our 3-foot distance. And by the way you measure this is with your body at this point in time. Your close order is touching shoulder to shoulder. Your regular order is with your elbows akimbo, they called it. You put your elbows out like this and you touch your elbows. That will space you out at about a 3-foot interval. Your open order is to your fingertips. That spaces you out at about 6-foot interval. To space the ranks, it's to the tip of the scabbard of the person in front of you. That's how you measure that distance. So now we're 5 ranks deep. So we're still only half of a typical pike formation. Typical pike formation would be 10 ranks deep. But what you'll see is, charge your pike. The reason the pikes are so long is they overlap. The first 5 ranks stick out in front of the formation. So like I said, I've got my partisan for breaking into the formation. I can run up and try to hook a pike out of the way, and then I can hook another pike out of the way, and then there's another one, and another one, and another one. Every 3 feet, there's a pike point. I have to get past 5 of them before I even get to the first guy. And he's got 9 buddies behind him. So this is an impenetrable hedge of steel. Basically, nothing gets into this. And you can actually advance like this. You can do what they call press of pikes. You can steamroller people off the battlefield with this hedge of pikes. 2 paces forward, march, and 1, 2, 1, 2. So it's very slow, but it's irresistible. It's like a glacier. It just pushes everything out of the way. The really ugly battles on the European battlefield were when 2 pike formations come together, because they come together really slowly like that, and the pike points start to slowly overlap as they go towards each other. Now, one of the things that they did that we're not doing here is they wore armor in their pike formations too. So you actually, even though the pike points are coming at you, you're protected by steel. Order your pike. Advance your pike. Clearing the lamps? Yep. Face by your right hand. Right. To your right hand wheel. Halt. Face about by your right hand. Port your pike. Port. Lower your pike. Raise your pike. Order your pike. Make your reverence. Cover. Now, one of the things you also might be wondering is, we think in terms of looking back at 375 years of history and what's happened in New England since then. These people were at the start of that historical cycle. So one of the things that we think about is the wars with the Native Americans. You know, for example, King Philip's Wars in the 1670s and things. And you look at this and you say, what good are pikes and things like that, armored cavalry, for fighting Native Americans? And the answer is they're no good at all. But the reason that they drilled like this and they brought this equipment was they weren't worried about the Native Americans. When the original Puritan colonists came to Massachusetts Bay and when the Plymouth colonists came to Plymouth, well, one of the reasons they picked Plymouth is there were no Native Americans living around Plymouth. There had been an epidemic in that area, and the Wampanoag village near Plymouth had been wiped out. So they actually picked Plymouth because there was nobody contesting the real estate when they landed there. In Massachusetts Bay, they thought that the natives would accept them as missionaries. They looked on themselves as bringing civilization and God's word, and the original seal of Massachusetts Bay Colony was a Native American with a scroll that said, "Come over and help us." For the first 10 years of the colony, they got along famously with the Wampanoags. They actually had them drill with them in their militia companies. It's the Pequot War in 1636 that sort of changes that whole thing. And the Pequots didn't live in Massachusetts. The Pequots are down in Rhode Island and Connecticut. So it was a long distance away. The reason that they drilled in the latest European tactics and used the latest European weapons is they were afraid of other Europeans. The French are in Acadia, which is now Maine. There's French colonists in Maine. The Dutch are in New York City. New Amsterdam was a Dutch colony. And the Spanish are down in Florida. We are at the same latitude as Madrid, Spain. If you want to sail from the New World to Europe, what you do is you come up the coast. If you're Spanish and you're living in Florida and you want to go to Madrid, you sail up the coast to Cape Cod and then you head across the ocean towards Spain. If you want to go to Holland, if you're from New Amsterdam, you want to go to Holland, you sail up to Nova Scotia and then you bang a right heading out across the ocean. So there's European ships going by here all the time. You know, there's a lot of colonists in the New World by this time. There's colonies all through the Caribbean. There's colonies in Maryland. There's colonies in Virginia, things like that. Europeans are going by here all the time. They're worried about having to fight Europeans. So they want to be up on the latest European drill, and they want to use the latest European weapons. This is a style of fighting that was developed by the Dutch. The Dutch are fighting a war of independence at the time of the American colonies being established in New England. The Netherlands is ruled by an Austrian king of Spain. This is the way authority worked in this period in time. It was who you married and who your parents were that determined who was in charge. So it happens that the king of Spain at this point in time, Philip II, is actually a Habsburg from Austria, who his parents married into the right family. He ends up the king of Spain, and he happens to own the Netherlands. The Netherlands have Protestant colonies or Protestant establishments in them. The Spanish are Catholic, and a religious war starts between the 9 independent provinces of the Netherlands and Spain. Spain has the largest army in Europe at that time. They're the richest, most powerful country in Europe. Netherlands is really small. The Dutch War of Independence lasts for 80 years. The American War of Independence took 8 years. The Dutch War of Independence against Spain lasted for 80 years. And the Dutch were big innovators. In order for little countries to fight big countries like Spain, they had to do tactical innovations. And so everybody watched what the Dutch were doing at this point in time. The English actually took part in some of these wars. and watched what the Dutch were doing, and they brought that over to the colonies. So this is actually Dutch drill practiced by Englishmen who come over to North America. Questions? Yes?
Pikemen versus archers. It seems like it'd be a particularly vulnerable formation to, a longbow.
Yeah, but you never have pikemen by themselves. This is the basis of Dutch innovation, is that it's really combined arms tactics. The Dutch use pikes, musketeers, and cavalry in integrated formations. So, yeah, standing in a close formation like that, letting somebody shoot arrows at you is not a healthy idea, but 2/3 of my guys are musketeers. I've got a better chance of going through your armor with a musket than you do going through my armor with a longbow. But the main thing is, the reason that you don't use longbows is you don't want to have to spend years learning how to be good at it. I can train a musketeer in a couple of weeks, and he doesn't have to have the muscular development that you have to be a good archer. Yes?
Pikes versus cannon.
Well, that's an interesting thing. The use of field the use of field artillery on the battlefields is very rudimental at this point. They are just developing small enough cannon to be able to maneuver them. The original use of cannon in the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, was in siege warfare. You can mount big guns in castles. You don't have to drag them around. Or if you want to knock holes in castles, you get really big guns, and you take a couple of weeks to get them to the castle. And some of these guns from the late Middle Ages are gigantic. I've crawled down the barrels of guns, and there's some old ones in Edinburgh Castle. I fit inside them. It took huge teams of oxen and special wagons and everything to drag them around. But once you placed one of these outside a castle wall, there was nothing the people in the castle could do about it. A lot of times, in the late Middle Ages, when the siege train arrived, the castle surrendered. They just, if somebody shows up with a 15-inch gun, they know that there's nothing they can do about it. Problem is, you can't maneuver those kinds of things around on a mobile battlefield. So right around the 1620s, the 1630s is when they're developing smaller cannon that they can maneuver around. So this is new technology. The Swedes were big innovators in this. Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, was a big fan of field artillery and stuff. And yeah, that changed. Once again, you pack people together in tight formations. You get yourself a couple of cannons and blow holes in them.
I would like to speak with you about that offline, so to speak, when you're finished, because this is a key point in the book that I'm writing.
Oh, okay, sure. Anybody else? Yeah.
Even dragging them, is it easy to take pike through forests?
No.
So I imagine that using these things in New England territory before all the forest had been cleared would be a little bit difficult?
Yes. And for example, the Pequot Wars and the King Philip's Wars and things like that, they didn't bring pikes. They didn't even bring them with them. They knew that there was no point. The Indians aren't mounted, so there's just no point in using them. They are aware of the nature of the forest and what the effect on tactics are. So, for example, the muskets that they brought, very few of them were full muskets. What Europeans call full muskets, which are very large. They're so heavy that you have a rest to rest them on when you're aiming them. They weigh like 15 pounds. They will punch through armor. Heavily armored cavalry, they'll go right through the guy and his suit of armor. But they're big and cumbersome to drag around. And they actually brought what they call bastard muskets, which there are small guns called calivers and carbines. And there are full muskets which are heavy and have rests. Bastard muskets are in between in size. So they're a little smaller and a little bit lighter, and they're easier to get around in the woods. The other thing that they liked to use in New England were fowling pieces. There were guns designed for shooting birds that had 6-foot-long barrels. They're not rifled, but they have really long barrels, and they're fairly small caliber. And they were designed for bird hunting. Well, they realized that those are really good for skirmishing in the woods. when you want to pick off instead of lining up shoulder to shoulder and volleying it, you've got your enemies lined up shoulder to shoulder, you're lined up shoulder to shoulder, and you're just putting as much lead down range. If you're skirmishing with small groups of people in the woods, a fowling piece is a really effective way. Even though it's long, the ability to pick out individual targets is a big advantage. And they knew this, and they brought a lot of fowling pieces with them. Yeah?
I'm curious about the economics of the weapons being imported. Were the pikes probably made locally as opposed to...
No. There's no integrated ironworks in New England until 1647. The first one is in Braintree. Furnace Brook is named after the first ironworks opened in the colonies, and the first successful one is in Saugus. So up until 1649, all iron and steel has to be imported into the colony. So they would do what we did actually. When we had these pikes made, we bought the pike points from England. They're patterned on Tower Armory pikes, and then we had somebody in New Hampshire cut the ash boards and make the poles for them. The swords would have all been imported, the armor was all imported. And that's one of the really neat things for reenactors about the Massachusetts Bay Colony, is that there haven't been any major wars in this area. So all the records from the early colonies survive. So we have the actual receipts. We know what armorers made their pike armor. We know how much they paid for it, 27 shillings a suit, and things, 17 shillings a suit, things like that. We have all this detailed information that survives in Massachusetts. It's really useful stuff. We know about the color of uniforms that they used.
Captain Kenworthy,
yes.
Would you also address compassing with respect to that question?
Oh yeah, here's another little thing. We had to go to a lot of work to get 16-foot ash poles. We had to have a mill specially cut a 16-foot ash board for us. Then we had to have a woodworker cut it on a table saw. He had to do it in his driveway because he needed 32 feet of room to run the board over the table saw. These are double tapered. They are actually widest at 3 feet from the bottom. They taper down to the bottom. They're widest where you grip them, and then they taper to the point, which makes them as light as possible without losing strength. And we used hand electric planers to do that. In Europe, they grew them that way. There's a technique you can use with an ash tree called coppicing. If you cut an ash tree off and leave a stump, it doesn't kill the ash tree. You get what are called water sprouts. Branches come out of the side of the stump, and they grow up. And the neat thing about them is they don't branch. And in about 10 years, you will get a 16-foot pole that is the right diameter for a pike pole with minimal knots in it. And it also it's not naturally round, naturally tapered, widest at the bottom, tallest at the top, and it's got a natural curve to it. Since it came out of the stump and curved like this, it's got most of its curve at the bottom and less curve at the top. And if you actually hold it that way with that curve, it holds straight. It'll straighten itself out. Europe is heavily farmed at this period. People have been farming Europe for 2,000 years by the 17th century. So there's not a lot of free woods and things. What you've got is managed woods. People don't, in Europe, they don't cut trees down for firewood. They cut branches off the trees. And that actually encourages growth in the trees. You prune trees, it makes them sprout more and things. So they would use billhook, instead of, what we do is chainsaw the trees over, fall them down and saw them up. They would do that if they were building a house or a barn or something like that. But if they needed firewood, they'd take a billhook and they'd just take some branches off. And it's the same thing with making pikes. They'd get themselves some ash trees and they'd coppice them, and every couple of years they'd take some pike poles off of it, and they just keep doing that. And you can do it for 500 years without killing the tree. Yeah?
So just a practical question is how you transport them in modern times. That's a long stick.
You get 4-inch PVC sewer pipe in 10-foot lengths. You glue 2 of them together. You put a screw fitting on one end, and you put them on the roof of my car. And if you walk down P Street, you'll see a car with two 17-foot long pieces of 4-inch PVC sewer pipe on the roof of it. They hold 4 pipes each. They weigh about 30 pounds when they're full, so you can actually just lift them off the car, and then they sleep on the side of my driveway.
And you do not take them on the plane?
Oh yeah, no.
Do you have any agreements with like universities anywhere or anything to grow ash trees for you for this, or?
No,
A special order?
I was trying to do it at my mother-in-law's house, but I don't think we're going to be able to get the...
I'm asking, University of New Hampshire in Durham, New Hampshire does things like that. We have built 2 gundelows.
Yeah.
And the forestry department there has grown trees specifically to provide masts for the gundelows.
Oh,
Something
wow.
you might
Yeah.
want to check out.
That's a
because
great idea.
They do things like that for different groups, so you might want to just check out.
See, we were very lucky. A little aside, you know, when we went to make the pikes, we originally started using PVC electrical conduit to do the drills. Our group specializes in drill, interpreting period manuals. So we do period fencing based on period manuals. We do 19th century drill based on period manuals. And there's a whole bunch of drill manuals from the 17th century. That's one of the neat things about that particular period. We used PVC pipe to start with, and then we're going to make the pikes. We've been doing a lot of demos over the years. We've been associated with the Higgins Armory. We do fencing demonstrations there and things. And a couple of years ago, they bought 2 original Lucerne Swiss pikes. So we got to play with those and measure them and everything, and that's where we got a lot of the information we needed. A lot of people who do this kind of stuff, they use closet poles. You wouldn't believe how clumsy a closet pole is compared to these. It really makes a difference to taper them correctly and to make them out of the correct wood. Ash is light and strong. You know, pine is not particularly strong, and oak closet poles are almost impossible. Yeah.
So on the battlefield, when you do have these 2 pikemen formations reaching each other, what happens to the formation when they reach each other?
It's like a giant rugby scrum. It's like a deadly rugby scrum. You start pushing on each other and push on each other, and they called it press a pike. It was absolutely horrible, but you know it's sort of a game of chicken. You're really pretty evenly matched. They start pressing on each other and stuff. One of the interesting things about these kind of formations in Europe is I mentioned integrated tactics. What the battlefields in this particular period look like chessboards. They would have all these geometric formations, squares and rectangles. They would line everybody up in these deep, narrow formations, and they would stagger them. They called it quincunx. They took that from the Romans. They would stagger the formations. So you wouldn't have a group of pikemen just standing by themselves in the battlefield. There would be another block of infantry in echelon behind them. So if you tried running up on the flank of them, well, there's another square on your flank. You know, and they would be able to turn sideways. You know, you can take the formations and flip them to any direction. So it's like a chess game, moving these little units around on the field. And this is the big innovation of the Dutch. The Spanish formations were tercios, which meant they had 3,000 men in them. The idea was, you know, you do that press a pike thing, you got 3,000 pikemen. Who's going to stand in your way? The problem is the formation's really, really slow. So what the Dutch are doing is they got their little 80-man and 160-man formations, and they're moving around these tercios. They're trying to get at them from the sides and the back. And what you find in these battles is that people who run, people who break on the battlefield, break from the back of the formation. If you're at the front of the formation, you can't get away, because you know you had all those overlapping pikes and stuff. You've got the same problem. If you try to run backwards in your formation, you've got all these pikemen behind you with their pikes all leveled, stuff like that. You can't get out of it. It's the guys at the back of the thing who are like, oh, it's not looking so good up there. I think I'm going to go get a cup of coffee. Yeah.
Also, on the battlefield, how is communication? Like, what communication do they use to?
The standard communication is drums. An infantry company like this would have 3 snare drummers, and they had standardized calls. And then the captain would be, in combat, the captain would be in the middle of formation about 3 ranks back with the ensign. So, you know, the ensign is a marker so that the generals can look out and see all their units on the battlefield. The captains are in the middle of formation. They've got sergeants along the edge to kind of keep the edges in shape. And you have drum calls and you have trumpet calls.
Eventually, there's going to be like too many soldiers to accurately communicate with new drones. So, what was the maximum army size on the field?
The maximum army size isn't actually regulated by communication at that time.
Okay.
It's regulated by economics. So you know, the reason the Spanish can do tercios is because they got a lot of money. They got all this gold and silver coming over from the New World, so they can make real. The armies back then are more like mercenaries than we're used to. Ethnic nationalism didn't exist as we understand it. They didn't necessarily have a problem with the fact that the Spanish king spoke German. That was the way things worked back then. So the soldiers, this is actually interesting from the viewpoint of the manual. We use a manual that was illustrated by an artist named de Gain, and it was published in The Hague in 1607. This was a standard drill manual that was used by a lot of European armies at the time, and it was adopted by a lot of the English units. De Gain published it for the Dutch. The Army of the States General wanted a drill manual. It's the first illustrated drill manual in history. But what's interesting about it, and especially useful for us, is the Dutch army was only 20% native Dutch. So when they published their drill manual, which is called the Exercise of Arms, they published it simultaneously in 5 languages. They published it in German, Danish, Dutch, French, and English. So we have a contemporary English translation of the Dutch drill manual from 1607. And so when you think about communication, the size of the armies, these guys don't even speak the same language. So this is why another reason that drum calls and bugle calls become important stuff is that even if you yelled at them, they wouldn't necessarily know what you were saying. So the armies are limited by the finances more than the command and control. A lot of it is sort of wind up and go. Like I said, you position your units carefully on the battlefield. Sometimes they wouldn't even fight. They kind of look and say, oh, there's no way I can get into that formation. We're not going to play that game today. But a lot of times you just start the units moving, and then it was kind of up to the individual commanders to pay attention to what they're doing. Yes? Yeah.
You mentioned that the Pikes were not useful against the Native Americans, and it was just against Europeans. So are there actually records of skirmishes and battles that they actually had with passing Europeans?
No, there's actually a fun. Well, yes, there is. I'm sorry, I was about to say no to that. There actually is a weird thing in the 1650s. England almost went to war with the Netherlands.
That's right.
There were 2 close calls with England almost starting to go to war. And the English colonists got really nervous about this because New Amsterdam's really close by. And they actually raised an army. These militias, this is actually a good thing to mention. These militias are not just military. They're similar to the National Guard in that they're a home defense force. But they didn't have police departments and fire departments and things like that back then. So all the townspeople took turns doing what they called watch and ward. You'd have 2 men wandering around the town from the local militia all the time, one with a musket, one with a half-pike. And they would give the alarm in case of fires. They would arrest drunks. They would serve warrants. All this sort of stuff was also part of the militia. So when they actually thought they were going to have a war with New Amsterdam, they didn't use the militias because the militias were tied to their towns. They actually recruited an army to go fight against New Amsterdam. Problem is the war never happened. And they had this nice shiny army all organized. So they were like, what are we going to do with this? I know, we'll go boot the French out of Maine. And that's what they did. They turned the army around and they went north. They just, it was like never waste a good army, right? So yes, they did fight other Europeans, but not much. Yes?
I just recently finished.
There was actually a lot of that.
Repeat the question.
The question is how much did other colonists besides English colonists, adopt tactics from Native Americans and work with the Native Americans? And the answer is a lot. You know, these people weren't stupid. You don't think that they got over here and they were just like, you know, we're doing it the way it was in England, we're doing it the way it was in Spain. You know, they understood that they had to adapt, you know, explicitly understood that they had to adapt to the environment. All these colonies used, well, they recruited native troops, you know, and there are spectacular cases of individuals being really stupid about this, you know, and getting yeah, exactly, you know, but you know, there are lots of examples of stupid generals everywhere in the world at all times. So the fact that one idiot, you know, just wasn't paying attention doesn't mean that everybody dismissed this stuff altogether. The other interesting thing is that you got to be careful about not thinking of Native American culture as being homogeneous. You know, there's a lot of different cultures in the New World, and a lot of different styles of living, and what they ran into in New England was there were different styles of living. So the Native Americans had palisaded towns, so you could use siege warfare tactics, you know, that were appropriate to Europe. You're not knocking down stone walls, you're knocking down wooden walls, but they still have fortified towns and things like that.
On the other hand, if you run into Aztec culture, you've got a whole other battlefield strategy there.
Yeah.
And a whole other geography.
Yeah. Other questions?
I was wondering about, you briefly skirted the political and economics. How often were independent mercenaries recruited into a general army?
All the time.
I just wanted to know if I had it right.
And the question is how many of them, really. The colony in 1629, the Massachusetts Bay Company hired two what they called technicians. These were drill masters. They were Englishmen who had grown up in the Netherlands. So I mentioned that the Netherlands were considered the tactical innovators of their time. They're replaced in the 1630s by the Swedish. You know, it sort of goes in evolutions, different places. But there were two people who had served as cadets in the House of the Prince of Orange, who were specifically hired by the Massachusetts Bay Colony to train the militia when they came over. John Underhill and Robert Patrick were their names, and they show up for the next 30 years, you know, as infantry commanders and things like that. When they have the people up war, John Underhill is one of the people who's hired to go along with them. The Plymouth colony had the same thing. Miles Standish was their drill master. So they start right off at the beginning hiring military experts, and then a lot of, you know, and this is really common in Europe. You know, in the wars in Europe, people, you know, hire themselves out, and they hire themselves out in regimental sizes. You know, the Dutch army had Scotch regiments. You know, entire regiments of Scotsmen would hire themselves as mercenaries and things like that.
It's always nice to know you got it.
Good. Other questions? Yes.
I reenacted the London Trayned Band Renaissance Fair, California, 10 plus years ago, and I was the ensign in that company. Curious, because almost all of it is identical from carried over, which makes sense, being the New World from England area. What did the ensign do aside from carrying the flag in communication with his troops, or what was his role aside from just carrying the flag around? So here I am. Curious about that.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look again. Most of what I'm used to is, you know, he is the third officer, so if you lose another officer, everybody has to be prepared. You know, this is one of the fun things about these drill manuals. There are so many drill manuals from that period, and it's really interesting to read them and compare and contrast them. You know, here's a, you know, I'm digressing on you, and I'll come back to your questions, so apologies, but one of the things you'll notice is we're all holding our weapons in our right hand. In order to fight in a pike formation, you have to have all the pikes on the same side. So one of the things people wonder about is, well, what do left-handed people do? Well, they fight right-handed if they're in a right-handed formation. But I have a wonderful drill manual from the 1630s, published in Edinburgh, which has all the drill right-handed at the beginning. And then it says in the drill manual, well, sometimes you have troops who are left-handed. So take all the left-handed people and put them together in their own formation. And here's all the same drills left-handed. You can do all this stuff left-handed. You just have to make sure that everybody's left-handed. It's all left, right, and all left. So it's a wonderful manual, a left-handed drill manual. So I just want to come back to your question. So there's specific instructions about what the responsibilities of the officers are, and I just don't remember anything else about the ensign besides the fact that he has to be ready to be the first lieutenant if the first lieutenant gets killed. Yeah.
Because I noticed that your ensign is extremely young, and I know that there is a tradition of having the younger sons, in the ones who aren't going to inherit anything, join the Army as ensigns extremely young, often in their teens, to learn the business of being a commander.
Yeah.
And I think this is still carried on to this very day with the military colleges which train the cadets who come out as ensigns.
Yeah. The age span, like I said, is 16 to 60. The actual person, if you say 1637, which is the first regimental muster, the guy who was actually the captain at that time was a guy named William Trask. He was the captain of the Salem Trayned band. He was also the muster master for the East Regiment. He was 51 years old. He was a mill owner in what is now Peabody, Massachusetts. But he was 51 years old, and he had actually been in New England since before the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Nobody knows how he actually got to New England, but they do. But he shows up on the records about 1624. So he was here before there was actually a colony. There were people who were sort of filtering into the area, even though it wasn't established. So yeah, you get very young to very old. Here's a neat little question. There's a woman named Virginia Anderson who wrote her PhD dissertation. She took the passenger manifests, all the passenger manifests that are complete from the passages for the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the first 10 years. And there's 7 of them. There's 7 passenger manifests that list every single passenger who came on a particular ship. And what she did was she tracked down the history of these people. She traced every person to the grave, figure out what they did, where they came from, what happened to them. One of the really amazing things to me was median age at death. Okay, up until the 1950s, the mean age of death at birth in the United States was 48. Up until the 1950s. Now it's gone up much older than that since the 1950s. A lot of medical advances recently, but up until the 1950s, it was 48. Guess what the mean age at death was of the colonists in the first decade of the Massachusetts Bay Colony? What?
70.
Yeah, there's actually 2. She actually did men and women separately.
Women probably died a lot in childbirth.
Yeah, but still, the median age, so that means half the people lived older than this. The median age at death for men was 69. The median age at death for women was 71. Half of the women who came over in the first decade of the colony lived to be over 71. It's 4 times the survival rate of the same demographics in England at that time. The death rate in childbirth was 1/4 what it was in England at that time.
Probably because there wasn't any germs.
The doctors.
That's it.
Very possibly,
We were dependent on midwives.
Yeah.
Wait, what was that again? This
Virginia Anderson.
Does this include all the people who died like the first year of
Yep.
the colony?
Yep. Yeah, the Plymouth Bay Colony had a really rough first winter. They lost half the people who came over on the Mayflower in the first winter. People learned from that. You know, this is what going back to what I was saying about they're not stupid. You know, they knew what happened in Plymouth, and so this is one of the reasons they bought enormous numbers of supplies. And when they came over to Massachusetts Bay Colony, they came in fleets, you know, 10 and 12 ships at a time, because they knew that if they came over like the Pilgrims had to Plymouth with the supplies, and if they came in the wintertime and things like that, they were going to die like flies. It was still a rough first couple of years. You know, it took a while to establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but it was nothing like it is as Plymouth. Other questions? Well, thank you very much.
Well, a song about never saying never and never being told what you can or cannot do. This is one of us. Before I got to fighting, or when fighting got to me, I looked to find examples on the field of chivalry, and I saw mighty arms, much stronger than my arms could ever be. So I thought perhaps that field was not for me. But still I stayed and watched the fighting, till one figure stood apart, in armor newly fashioned, and a helm more pot than art. But each blow was thrown with honor and the lightness of the heart. So I took that step which soon became a start. 'Cause she was not the biggest fighter, nor one to raise a fuss, but I remember being proud that she was one of us. And we might never stand together in a shield wall side by side. Because of her I lift my sword with pride. She was ladylike and lively, not the type you would expect, with a braver heart than many and a slot shot to respect. And I guess she'd once decided this was where she'd like to be, and I thought if she could do it, why not?